So I've been thinking a lot about fighting games and what sets them apart from other genres of esports. And I really wanted to take the time to sort of quantify my thoughts and open it up for discussion with the community. And I think the biggest difference between fighting games and other competitive gaming genres is the fact that they are pretty much always a 1v1 competition. It's always just you versus your opponent, right? Whereas most of the other popular esports on the market are team-based. This means that in a fighting game, you're responsible for 100% of the decision-making on your end. Whereas in a team game, you and a group of other people work together to make decisions. And you make solo decisions that are based on information given to you and other decisions made by other people on your team. That's not the case in fighting games. In fighting games, it is simply your decision-making against your opponent's decision-making. And I think that's something that makes fighting games really unique. Granted, there are other games that aren't fighting games that do take place in a 1v1 setting. For instance, StarCraft 2 and Quake. But I think even those games have like a different... The one-on-one feeling of those games is a bit different. And I think that's due to the fact that in a fighting game, you see your opponent 100% of the time. You are interacting with the other player 100% of the time, all the time. They are always on screen, you can always see what they're doing, and you can always passively process information that way. Whereas in a game like StarCraft, you can't see what your opponent is building until you send scouts to go check it out, right? You have to actively make the decision to go gain visual data on your opponent. And in Quake, there are just times where you just can't see your opponent because of the map. Either they're hiding from you or you're hiding from them. Something like that. In fighting games, you can always see your opponent. So it's up to you to constantly be processing what your opponent's doing all the time, based on the objective information that you get from seeing them. I think that's a big thing about fighting games that I don't think gets talked about a lot. Is the constant visual information all the time. It's also really unique and interesting. I can't think of another game that does that. And apart from that, seeing what your opponent is doing, moves in a fighting game are always very quantifiable, right? They always do pretty much the same thing every time. So if I go into the lab and lab out what a Shoryuken does, I can guarantee that every time I input a Shoryuken with Ryu, for instance, it's going to do the same thing every time. And if I lab out what it is on block, it's always going to be that on block. This is, of course, barring, outlier examples. Like, sometimes in Tekken, moves will change frame data based on the spacing and stuff like that. But barring that, those special instances, you can pretty much always rely on training mode to tell you how to handle things. Or at least help you figure out how you should be handling them. And I think you can, in a game like League of Legends, you can prepare for certain situations. You can, be ready for your enemy's team comp, and you can gather information on the ways that they like to approach the game. but it doesn't always exactly play out that way, right? Their positioning might be slightly different, or the items that they build might be different, or the skills that they decide to use might be different. It's there's a lot more. I don't want to say there's more variables because that sounds like I'm simplifying fighting games. I should say it's harder to solve things wholly in MOBAs. Like if I look up a Shoryuken, for instance, I'm using that because it's an easy example. I can solve the problem of getting hit by a Shoryuken, right? I can block it and punish it. And every time I block a Shoryuken, I know that I'll be able to punish it. And that's something that I can ingrain into my muscle memory to where I don't even have to think about it anymore. And based on my time with the time that I've spent playing FPS games and MOBAs and stuff, I don't feel that in those games. I think what I'm looking for here is the term knowledge checks. I think fighting games check your knowledge of the game more than any other genre. I think that's the best way to quantify it. So the game is well, more so your opponent, really. Your opponent is always asking you, do you know how to deal with this? Have you gone into the lab to figure out this situation? Or do you have enough understanding of the game to figure this out on the fly right now? Right? So the game is constantly asking you to solve those problems based on knowledge, where FPS games are more so asking you to solve problems based on strategies that you've prepared and also reactions to what you see in front of you. I think I said that in a way that makes sense. It's just like a different way to solve problems. Because I think that's what competition is all about. It's solving the problems that your opponent places in front of you. And I think fighting games have the most consistent answers to those problems as long as you take the time to study how to beat them. So it falls down to a lot of knowledge checks of, do you know how to deal with this? Not only do you know how to deal with this, but can you activate that knowledge in a live setting? Right? So I might know that I can punish a Dragon Punch if I block it, a Shoryuken. But do I know my character's optimal punish? Am I going to be able to punish my opponent for doing that move to the best of my character's ability? That falls on the preparedness thing and the studying. And then also, your physical reflexes to be able to do it in a match, which is usually harder than it seems. A lot of that comes down to committing things to muscle memory. It's, see that I block the Shoryuken, and then my muscle memory activates to create the punish. And I think that type of knowledge check is really unique to fighting games. On top of that, it's like segueing into this, you're really responsible for your own learning in fighting games. And I mean, that's true in any game. But going off of what I said about like having practice mode and being able to find answers to these situations, you have to be willing to do that. You have to be ready to go into training mode on your own time and just grind out these specific situations. Block that Shoryuken over and over and over until that punishment is second nature to you and you don't even have to think about it anymore. You can activate your muscle memory based on what you're seeing. So you're responsible for doing things outside of the game, outside of playing the game, in order to make your gameplay better, which is true of other esports and stuff. Like, you know, you can practice, you know, positioning with your team and setting up certain plays on certain maps and stuff like that. That's all important. But I think this is another situation where the whole it's just you against your opponent comes into play, because you're responsible for learning. You're technically responsible for learning everything about the game, right? And everyone in the world fails at that. Nobody in the world is ever gonna know everything about the fighting game that they play, ever. If there's somebody out there that does know literally everything there is to know about a fighting game, then congratulations to them. But it's your job as a fighting game player to know everything. Whereas in a team-based game, you might have to understand, like have a vague understanding of everything. But all in all, most team games, you end up playing a position. And it's your job to then become an expert of that position. And then stuff that doesn't pertain to that position, a lot of times you rely on your teammates for. And that's not to say you don't learn it, but you don't have to learn it as fluently as your teammates that cover that position, right? Whereas in a fighting game, you're responsible for all of the information and all of the knowledge that's available for you to find. So I think that's a key difference between preparing in a fighting game and preparing in a MOBA or an FPS. I think another big thing about the learning curve is that games in a fighting game are generally a lot shorter than in a shooter or a MOBA. Games of League of Legends on average take 30 to 40 minutes. And that's usually if one team is doing really well and beating the other team decidedly. If the game's really close, it can go on for over an hour. I've been in games of League of Legends that have gone on for, 90 minutes. And it's grueling. And the stamina to play one game that long and keep your mental fortitude for one game for that long, that's a skill in itself. But the skill that applies to fighting games is accessing the knowledge that you need all into, and then condensing it into 60-second rounds, or in the case of Street Fighter, 99-second rounds. And then you get 2 or 3 of those rounds per game to use that knowledge to beat your opponent. A game of Tekken on average can last like 5 minutes, and that's if the players are going back and forth and playing really solid defense. So there's much less opportunity for you to gather information on your opponent and use it to beat them, which I think is very important to understand. And then in a tournament set, for instance, you have 2 out of 3 games. You have 1 game to lose, and you have to use that 1 game as a tool to win 2 games. If that makes any sense. So you have 1 game to throw away for the sake of gaining information, and then you have to use that information that you gained in 1 game to win 2 games. And that's a very important dynamic that a lot of people lose. Even people who play fighting games lose out on the importance of condensing all of your knowledge and your skill into a 2 out of 3 set. I've heard plenty of people talk about themselves or other players as describing themselves or other players as better in long sets or better in tournament. They're both very different skills. But the one that's important that pertains to esports is taking everything you know and applying it into a set that will last maybe 10 minutes. Like, on average, 10 minutes to play a set. That's not even the laning phase of one League of Legends game. So applying all that information very quickly is a very different skill in itself. And again, this isn't the intent of this video wasn't to say, oh, fighting games are better than other esports, because I don't think that that's objectively true. I just sort of wanted to discuss why they're different, right? Like, what makes a fighting game different from a shooter, despite, you know, the obvious from that you get from looking at the screen. And hopefully I was able to make some points that make sense. And I want to continue this discussion with you guys. So in the comment section, let me know what you think. You know, did I miss anything about what makes fighting games unique and challenging in a different way? Or maybe was I wrong about some points and some other games do reflect similar qualities? Let me know. And I hope that if you're coming into fighting games and trying to find information on them, I hope you find something of what I said interesting, especially if you're coming from other esports, you know. So let me know what you guys think. I hope you guys like this. This is a sort of a new form of video that I decided to just sort of casually play unranked matches and just sort of have this discussion, mostly with myself, but hopefully with you guys too. Let me know what you think of it. If you think I should scrap it and go with some more structured talking form videos, because I definitely like having, you know, fighting game philosophy discussions. But if you think I should scrap the sort of freeform vibe and go with something a little bit more structured, then let me know. I just figured I would try something new, since I think I'm better at talking when I'm sort of free-forming it and I don't have note cards in front of me. But let me know what you guys think. So thank you for watching, and I hope you found some of the points interesting or worth discussing, and I hope you found something informative.